8,000 RPM from a pushrod V8. In 1969, that number was pure fantasy. Big block muscle cars were struggling to hit 6,000 RPM without grenading. European sports cars with their sophisticated overhead cams could barely touch 7,500. Yet here was Ford, claiming their new Boss 302 could scream to 8,000 RPM all day long. The automotive press called it impossible. Chevrolet engineers said it was a lie, right up until Parnelli Jones started leaving everyone in his dust at Riverside. Picture this. It's February 1969, and the Trans Am season opener is about to start. The paddock is filled with Camaros, Javelins, and Barracudas, all packing to stroked big blocks, because everyone knew that was the only way to make serious power under the 305 cubic inch limit. Then the Boss 302 Mustangs fire up. The sound is different, higher pitched, angrier. These things are revving like Formula One cars, not American muscle. When the green flag drops, Jones rockets away from the field like they're standing still. By lap 10, he's got a 20-second lead. The competition is speechless. Ford just rewrote the rulebook with an engine that shouldn't exist. This is the story of the Boss 302, the small block that killed the big block myth, dominated Trans Am racing, and proved that American engineers could build engines that revved to the moon while making power that embarrassed motors twice their size. To understand why the Boss 302 was such a shock to the system, we need to travel back to the muscle car landscape of 1968. The horsepower wars were in full swing. Chrysler had their 426 Hemi. Chevrolet was dropping 427s into everything that moved. Ford's own 428 Cobra Jet was terrorizing drag strips. These were low-revving torque monsters, massive pistons, long strokes, and red lines around 5,500 RPM, if you were brave. The formula was simple: cubic inches equals power. Nobody was talking about RPM because American V8s simply didn't enter the Sports Car Club of America's Trans Am series. This wasn't drag racing. This was road racing. Tight corners, hard braking, sustained high RPM. The rules were specific. Engines couldn't exceed 305 cubic inches, and they had to be based on production models sold to the public. Suddenly, the big block formula didn't work. You couldn't just stuff a 427 under the hood and call it a day. Engineers had to think differently. Chevrolet's solution was to destroke their 327 down to 302 cubic inches, creating the Z28. It was good for about 290 horsepower and could rev to 7,000 RPM, impressive for the time. AMC and Chrysler followed similar paths. Everyone was building traditional small blocks with slightly sportier internals, conservative, safe, predictable. Ford's Larry Shinoda and the engineering team had other ideas. They weren't interested in building just another high-performance small block. They wanted to build something revolutionary. The target was clear: create a 302 cubic inch engine that could rev higher, breathe better, and make more power than anything the competition could imagine. But here's where it gets interesting. The foundation was Ford's existing 302 Windsor block, standard bore of 4 inches, stroke of 3 inches. Nothing exotic there. But what Ford did to that basic block was pure insanity. First came the heads, not just any heads. These were the legendary tunnel port designs. Picture conventional cylinder heads where the intake ports run relatively straight from the intake manifold to the valve. Simple, effective, been working for decades. Ford threw that out the window. The tunnel port heads featured massive intake ports that actually passed over the pushrod tubes, hence the tunnel name. These ports were enormous. We're talking about 2.23-inch intake valves and 1.71-inch exhaust valves. For perspective, big block engines were running smaller valves than this little 302. The intake ports flowed over 300 cubic feet per minute at 0.500-inch lift. That's race engine territory. The average street 302 head flowed maybe 185 CFM on a good day. these tunnel ports were moving 60% more air. But massive ports create their own problems. At low RPM, the air velocity drops, killing torque and drivability. Ford didn't care. This wasn't meant to idle smoothly at stoplights. This was a race engine barely tamed for the street. The camshaft profile reflected this philosophy, a solid lifter design with 0.477-inch lift and 290 degrees of duration. In modern terms, that's a relatively mild cam. In 1969, for a factory engine, it was borderline psychotic. The solid lifters were crucial. Hydraulic lifters, which most engines used, have a cushion of oil that helps quiet valve train noise but limits RPM. Above 6,500 RPM, hydraulics start to pump up and hold valves open, causing catastrophic engine failure. Solid lifters have no such limitation. They're noisy, require regular adjustment, and most manufacturers avoided them in street cars. Ford embraced them because they knew this engine would live above 7,000 RPM. The bottom end got similar treatment. Forged steel crankshaft instead of cast iron. Forged aluminum pistons with thick crowns and reinforced pin bosses. Heavy-duty connecting rods with 3 8-inch bolts. The compression ratio was set at 10.5.1, high enough to make power, but still able to run on pump gas. Every component was overbuilt for one reason: to survive, sustained 8,000 RPM operation. The valve train was particularly special. Ford used screw-in rocker arm studs instead of the standard pressed-in type. Under extreme RPM, pressed-in studs could literally pull out of the head. The valve springs were dual units with dampers, capable of controlling the valves at speeds that would send standard springs into surge. The pushrods were hardened steel, thicker than standard to resist flexing at high RPM. Let me put that 8,000 RPM capability in perspective. At that speed, each piston is traveling up and down 133 times per second. The valves are opening and closing 66 times per second. The forces trying to tear this engine apart are exponential compared to a typical 5,500 RPM redline. Most American V8s would scatter their internals across the track attempting these speeds. The Boss 302 asked for more. Ford claimed 290 horsepower at 5,800 RPM and 290 lb-ft of torque at 4,300 RPM. Everyone knew these numbers were a joke. Insurance companies were cracking down on high-performance cars, and manufacturers were deliberately underrating their engines. Independent dyno testing showed the real numbers: 370 to 385 horsepower at 6,800 RPM. Some examples pulled over 400 horsepower with nothing more than proper tuning and headers. The intake manifold was an aluminum dual-plane design specifically matched to the tunnel port heads. It featured smaller runners than you'd expect, designed to keep air velocity high. Remember, this engine made peak power at nearly 7,000 RPM. Traditional hot rod thinking about big ports and big carburetors didn't apply here. This was European sports car thinking applied to American muscle. Feeding this beast was a Holley 780 CFM 4-barrel carburetor. Again, unconventional thinking. Most performance 302s ran 600 CFM carbs. The Boss needed that extra airflow because it actually used it. At 8,000 RPM, this little engine was consuming as much air as a big block at 5,500 RPM. The exhaust system was equally purposeful. The tunnel port heads required special headers because the exhaust ports exited at unusual angles. Standard headers wouldn't fit. Ford designed specific units with equal-length primary tubes to optimize exhaust scavenging. Even the factory exhaust manifolds were special castings unique to the Boss 302. Now, building a high revving engine is one thing. Making it live on the street is another. Ford had to homologate this engine for Trans Am racing, which meant selling it to the public. The SCCA required manufacturers to build at least 1,000 units to qualify. Ford planned to build exactly that many. Then something unexpected happened. The Boss 302 Mustang hit showrooms in April 1969. It was supposed to be a limited production homologation special that only hardcore racers would want. The combination of Larry Shinoda's aggressive styling, that distinctive chin spoiler, rear window slats, and bold graphics, with the reputation of that screaming engine created unexpected demand. Dealers couldn't keep them in stock. The driving experience was unlike any American car. The engine was practically dead below 3,500 RPM. The radical cam and huge ports meant zero low-end torque. But keep your foot in it, and at 4,000 RPM, the Boss transformed. The engine note changed from a lumpy idle to a shriek. Power built in a linear rush that kept pulling harder and harder. At 6,000 RPM, where most muscle cars were gasping, the Boss was just getting started. 7,000 RPM came and went. The tack needle swept past 7,500. At 8,000 RPM, the engine was still pulling hard, sounding like nothing Detroit had ever produced. Car and Driver tested a Boss 302 in 1969. Their reaction? The Boss 302 is probably the best handling car Ford has ever built. They recorded 0-60 in 6.9 seconds and a quarter-mile time of 14.85 seconds at 96 mph. Those numbers might not sound impressive today, but remember the context. This engine gave up 100-plus cubic inches to its big block competitors. It was matching their straight-line performance while absolutely destroying them on a road course. But the street cars were just the opening act. The real story was happening on racetracks across America. Trans Am racing in 1969 and 1970 was effectively a battle between Ford and Chevrolet, with AMC and Chrysler playing supporting roles. The Camaro Z28 had won the championship in 1968 and 1969. Mark Donohue was Chevrolet's ace driver, and his Penske-prepared Camaros were considered unbeatable. Ford handed their factory effort to Budmore Engineering. The race-prepared Boss 302s were different animals entirely. The engines were blueprinted and balanced to perfection. The tunnel port heads were extensively ported, flowing over 340 CFM. The compression ratio was bumped to 12.5.1. Special camshafts with even more radical profiles were fitted. These race engines were producing 450 to 470 horsepower at 8,500 RPM. Some dyno pulls showed peaks above 9,000 RPM. The transformation on track was immediate. Parnelli Jones, the 1963 Indy 500 winner, was Ford's lead driver. In the 1969 season opener at Michigan International Speedway, Jones didn't just win, he dominated. His Boss 302 Mustang led 234 of 255 laps. The Camaros couldn't match the Ford's high RPM power. On long straights, the Boss 302s would simply drive away. The tunnel port heads gave the Boss 302 a unique advantage. Above 6,500 RPM, those massive ports that killed low-end torque became a superpower. The engine could breathe in ways the competition's conventional heads simply couldn't match. While Chevrolet's engineers scrambled to find more power from their traditional setup, Ford was exploring uncharted territory. George Follmer joined Jones for the 1970 season, and Ford's dominance was complete. The Boss 302 Mustangs won the Trans Am Championship, ending Chevrolet's reign. Jones won 5 races, Follmer won 5 races, and Ford clinched the manufacturer's title with races to spare. The high-revving gamble had paid off spectacularly. The racing success translated to street credibility. Suddenly, everyone wanted a Boss 302. Ford had planned to build just enough to satisfy homologation requirements. They ended up building 7,013 units in 1969 and another 7,013 in 1970. That number wasn't random. Ford simply kept production running until demand slowed. But here's what made the Boss 302 truly special. It changed the conversation about American performance. Before the Boss, the formula was simple. Bigger is better. Displacement was king. The Boss 302 proved that sophistication could beat size, that RPM could replace cubic inches. that American engineers could build engines as technically advanced as anything from Europe. The influence rippled through Detroit. Chevrolet developed their LT1350 small block partly in response to the Boss 302's success. Chrysler created their 340 six-pack. The entire industry started paying attention to cylinder head flow, valve train stability, and high RPM operation. The Boss 302 had shown the way forward. The technical legacy is equally important. The tunnel port head design, while too radical for street use, influenced Ford's racing programs for decades. The Cleveland Series heads that followed borrowed heavily from the tunnel port's lessons. The emphasis on RPM capability became standard in Ford's performance engines. Even today's Coyote 5.0 V8, with its 7,500 RPM redline, carries DNA from the Boss 302. Consider what Ford achieved. They took a basic 302 cubic inch block and made it competitive with engines nearly twice its size. They did it not through exotic materials or complex technology, but through intelligent engineering. Every component was optimized for one goal: high RPM operation. The result embarrassed the competition and forced the entire industry to evolve. The engine's weaknesses were also its strengths. Yes, it had no low-end torque. Yes, it required constant valve adjustments. Yes, it got terrible gas mileage. But none of that mattered. This wasn't transportation. It was barely street-legal race technology. Owners understood they were buying something special, something that required commitment. The Boss 302 also proved that factory hot rods could be more than just straight-line missiles. The complete package, engine, suspension, brakes, transmission, was developed as a system. Ford didn't just drop a hot engine in a Mustang and call it done. They created a balanced performance car that could compete with Europe's best on a road course while still destroying muscle cars at the drag strip. The production numbers tell another story. Of the 7,013 built in 1969, approximately 4,500 were fastbacks and 2,513 were sports roofs. Colors ranged from Wimbledon white to Calypso coral, though the most popular were the high-impact colors like Grabber orange and Grabber blue. Each car came with a warranty that was essentially void the moment you took delivery. Ford knew these would be raced. The race-prepared versions were even more extreme. Bud Moore's team would tear down engines after every race weekend. They found that even with the overbuilt internals, the sustained 8,500 RPM operation took its toll. Valve springs would lose tension, rod bearings showed wear. But the engines rarely failed catastrophically. They were tough in ways that surprised even Ford's engineers. The cost of this performance was significant. A Boss 302 Mustang started at $3,580 in 1969, about $500 more than a base Mach 1. In today's money, that's roughly $30,000. But buyers got their money's worth. Beyond the engine, the Boss 302 included heavy-duty suspension, power front disc brakes, close ratio 4-speed transmission, and limited slip differential. It was a complete performance package. The street racing scene embraced the Boss 302 immediately. Its high-strung nature made it perfect for stoplight-to-stoplight battles where drivers could keep the engine in its power band. The distinctive exhaust note, a combination of the solid lifter's clatter and the high RPM wail, became legendary. You could hear a Boss 302 coming from blocks away. Maintenance was intensive by modern standards. The solid lifters needed adjustment every 3,000 miles. The radical cam made the engine temperamental when cold. The tunnel port heads were prone to fuel puddling at low speeds, causing rough idle and occasional stalling. The Holley carburetor needed constant attention. But owners didn't care. They understood they owned something special. The racing development continued through 1970. Ford's engineers extracted even more power through careful development. Titanium valves reduced reciprocating weight. Experimental camshafts pushed the duration past 320 degrees. Dry sump oiling systems allowed sustained 9,000 RPM operation. By the end of the Trans Am program, race engines were producing nearly 500 horsepower from 302 cubic inches, a specific output of 1.65 horsepower per cubic inch. That was Formula One territory. The end came suddenly. After dominating the 1970 Trans Am season, Ford withdrew from racing. The Boss 302 was discontinued, emissions regulations were tightening, insurance costs were skyrocketing, and the muscle car era was ending. The Boss 302 went out on top, undefeated and still mysterious to competitors who never quite figured out how Ford made it work. Today, Boss 302 Mustangs are among the most coveted muscle cars. Clean examples sell for six figures. The engines are rebuilt with reverence, using modern technology to improve what was already remarkable. The aftermarket has developed aluminum versions of the tunnel port heads that flow even better than the originals. Modern Boss 302 builds are producing 500-plus horsepower naturally aspirated, still revving to 8,000 RPM and beyond. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The Boss 302 represented a philosophical shift in American performance. It proved that sophistication could triumph over brute force, that engineering excellence mattered more than displacement, that Detroit could build world-class performance engines when challenged. The tunnel port heads remain legendary among engine builders. Their radical design was perhaps too advanced for 1969 technology. With modern CNC porting and computational fluid dynamics, we now understand why they worked so well. The port shape created a natural ram effect at high RPM. The valve angles promoted excellent flow characteristics. Ford's engineers were decades ahead of their time, building something that modern technology has only recently caught up to. Consider the broader context. In 1969, Ferrari's Formula One engines were revving to 10,000 RPM with dual overhead cams and 4 valves per cylinder. Ford achieved 80% of that capability with pushrods and 2 valves per cylinder. The Boss 302 proved that American engineering ingenuity could compete with anyone, anywhere, using completely different solutions. The influence extends beyond Ford. The LS7 427 that Chevrolet developed decades later follows the Boss 302's philosophy, high RPM capability from a pushrod design. The modern Dodge Hellcat engines, while supercharged, embrace the same high RPM mentality. The Boss 302 showed that American V8s didn't have to be lazy, low-revving torque engines. They could scream to red lines that seemed impossible. For the engineers who developed it, the Boss 302 was a career highlight. Larry Shinoda went on to design for other manufacturers, but always called the Boss 302 his greatest achievement. The Bud Moore race team members still gather to celebrate their Trans Am championships. Parnelli Jones considers his Boss 302 victories as satisfying as his Indy 500 win. The owner's community remains passionate. Boss 302 registries track surviving cars. Restoration specialists document every original detail. The sound of a Boss 302 at full song, that distinctive mechanical symphony of solid lifters, tunnel ports, and 8,000 RPM, still raises goosebumps at car shows 50 years later. Modern Ford performance hasn't forgotten. The 2012-2013 Boss 302 Mustang revival paid homage to the original while adding modern technology. The Roadrunner 5.0 engine in that car revved to 7,500 RPM and produced 444 horsepower. It was brilliant, but it couldn't capture the raw mechanical intensity of the original. Some things can't be replicated. The original Boss 302 remains a high watermark in American performance. It was the right engine at the right time, developed by engineers who refused to follow convention. In an era of big blocks and lazy torque curves, Ford built a small block that revved like a sport bike and dominated on racetracks. It forced the competition to rethink everything they knew about making power. That's the real legacy of the Boss 302. Not just the championships or the street victories or the astronomical RPM capability. It's the proof that American engineers, when challenged, could innovate in ways nobody expected. The Boss 302 didn't just compete with the world's best, it beat them at their own game, using push rods and a carburetor while they relied on overhead cams and fuel injection. Today, when enthusiasts debate the greatest engines ever built, the Boss 302 always enters the conversation. Not because it was the most powerful, or the most refined, or the most reliable, but because it was the most surprising. Nobody saw it coming. A pushrod V8 that revved to 8,000 RPM shouldn't have been possible in 1969. Ford built it anyway, sold it to the public, and used it to dominate the competition. That tunnel port head design, those forged internals, that solid lifter valve train, they all came together to create something magical. An engine that broke every rule about what American V8s were supposed to be. An engine that proved displacement wasn't everything. An engine that showed the world Detroit could build sophisticated, high-revving power plants that belonged on a racetrack. The Boss 302 shocked everyone because it wasn't supposed to exist. Convention said pushrod engines couldn't rev that high. Physics said those tunnel ports would never work on the street. Competition said Ford couldn't build a better mousetrap. They were all wrong. Gloriously, triumphantly, 8,000 RPM wrong. What's your take on the Boss 302? Have you ever heard one of these engines at full song? That banshee wail at 8,000 RPM is something you never forget. Drop a comment below with your Boss 302 stories or what you think about Ford's high-revving gamble that paid off. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Detroit's most revolutionary engines, make sure to subscribe because we're just getting started exploring the engineering marvels that changed automotive history.